Hey there, it's Silver. This is the Turtle Beach Stealth Ultra controller. So I do like to occasionally take a look at gamepads because as someone that pretty much exclusively plays on PC, it's nice to have some around because hey, some games just work better with the controller, and we're kind of spoiled for choice these days when it comes to the gamepads available. There are lots and lots of them, and many of them are really good, and there are also lots of different price points to consider. But this time we're delving more into the high end of the price points because this is clearly meant to compete with the other really high-end options. So we're talking stuff like the Xbox Wireless Elite Series 2 or the PlayStation DualSense Edge, that kind of area. So in this case we've got a very fully featured wireless controller. And first off, a quick shout out to Turtle Beach for actually sending this over to me so that I could take a look at it. There's one thing to know about this controller right from the start, one thing that you should sort of be looking at in terms of why the price point is the way it is and what might make it really good for you. And that, if you just listen right here, Microswitches. This is a huge selling point for me because it's not all that common for controllers to use microswitches, and especially uncommon for them to use them in areas like the D-pad, which this controller does. For those who don't know why this is a big deal, a lot of controllers use membrane buttons, where there is a sort of rubber membrane that sits over the circuit board beneath the buttons, and when you press one of the buttons down, it's squishing down on that rubber membrane and pressing it against the circuit board so that the controller knows what buttons you're pressing. This is a perfectly acceptable way to make buttons for a controller, but it does have drawbacks. For one, they don't feel as good because they're kind of squishy and not quite as definite. But two, and probably more of a bigger deal for most people, they don't have a tremendous amount of longevity. A lot of these buttons will wear out over time, and as they wear out, as you use the controller more and more, they will get less and less responsive until you have to press them harder or press them multiple times for them to actually work. This also means that if something goes wrong and you would like to replace things yourself rather than buying an entirely new controller, it's really hard to do so because you usually have to replace the entire membrane or sometimes even the entire circuit board, which is just not really something that's easily available for most people. However, microswitches are individual small switches, one for each button, that have a much more clicky, definite response, so they feel really good to use, and they're also rated for usually several million presses per switch. This means that they are far more durable than membrane buttons and also feel better, but also just more responsive in general, often faster. And it also means that if one of them goes bad over time, you can just replace the one that went bad, rather than having to replace the entire membrane or even more. This controller uses a large number of microswitches. Almost everything that can be switched is. So all the face buttons, the entire D-pad, the left and right bumpers, and the 4 customizable buttons on the back of the controller, all of those are microswitched. And I haven't really seen a controller that uses switches for the D-pad in a long time. That is really uncommon. It's kind of expensive to do so because you have to have 8 in sort of a radial pattern, all in really close proximity on the circuit board. It is a bit of a tricky thing to fit them all in there. But as a result, the D-pad on this controller feels extremely good, and I have a feeling if you are looking at something small, something handheld, not a fight stick, if you're a fighting game player, this would actually be really good for that because of how precise and definite the directions are on this D-pad. It works really, really well for fighting games. It actually brings me back to the Neo Geo Pocket Color, which is something that I'm guessing about 3 people in the world actually remember, but it was a really cool little handheld console that had a micro-switched stick as its D-pad, and because it had tons of fighting games on it, because it's a Neo Geo thing, so it just felt really good to use, and this is kind of reminiscent of that. Now you could also say that there is sort of an analog version of a microswitch, by which I mean there are analog components you can use that also are more responsive and have a much better longevity than the normal ones, and that is of course Hall effect components, magnetic stuff. And this controller does indeed use those as well, so both of the analog sticks are Hall effect sticks, which means they by default have a really small, narrow dead zone because Hall effect is so precise it doesn't need very much of a dead zone to work correctly. They're also really responsive and fast and feel extremely smooth and nice to use. Also, of course, the main draw of Hall effect is that it will never develop stick drift, so you are not going to have to replace these sticks because they start to drift after a year or 2 of use. Some controllers also put Hall effect sensors on the triggers since they are analog axes as well. I'm not 100% sure if this controller has them or not, I can't tell. It sort of feels like that's what they are. They have that sort of stiff pull but really smooth operation to them that makes me think they're magnetic, but I'm not completely sure if they are or not. Either way, they're really solid analog triggers that feel good to use and also have their own separate vibration motors that you can tweak the intensity of. Now, I'm sure one of the most obvious things that everyone noticed immediately was the fact that this controller has a screen on it. This is actually a pretty cool idea. I was somewhat expecting this to be maybe a little bit gimmicky, but there are two main reasons why I don't feel that it really is, and I'll get onto those in a few. But first off, what's the screen even for? Well, it's actually for just messing with all the settings of the controller, which means you don't need external software on your PC in order to mess with the things that the controller can do, which is a huge deal. All you have to do is press this button right here and it will switch the controller into a sort of settings mode that makes the D-pad and buttons control the screen instead of control your PC or whatever else you have this connected to, so that you can temporarily mess with this screen and do whatever it is you need to do. You then press the button again and it goes back to its normal control. The screen allows you to customize anything from the lighting on the controller's sort of handle bits. If you want to change the intensity or the effects or the color of that on the fly, you can. You can also change the dead zones of both analog sticks on the fly, as well as the vibration intensity for all 4 vibration motors separately. You can even change stick movement curves if you want a more or less sensitive or precise kind of curve, depending on what sorts of games you're playing. For instance, really precise competitive FPS versus, say, a fighting game might have a very different style of curve that you want to use, and you can change all of that on the fly here. There are even a couple of other things you can do with it. You can customize what the 4 back buttons actually do on the fly, so if you don't want to use an external program to change what the macro buttons do, you can just change what they do right here, which is pretty cool. This means that you can even alter what they do mid-game if you want. And also, this does have a headset socket on the bottom, so you can plug in a headset, and there are several options related to audio on the screen as well if you happen to have a headset plugged in. This is not only compatible with Turtle Beach headsets, but you can use this stuff on any headset you want to plug in, which is really nice. So what makes me think that it's not too much of a gimmick? Well, it's obviously a little bit gimmicky to put a screen on a controller. I think that's unavoidable, but the things that make it not a negative for me are, for one, it turns off immediately when you're not using it, which means it's not constantly draining your battery whether you want to use it or not, which is really good. But also, it's just really convenient to be able to have all of these options on a sort of on-the-fly menu that you don't need an external program to access. So that helps it feel less gimmicky because it's providing you an optional but really useful convenience. There's another feature of this thing that can also be considered something like that. There is a charging dock that actually comes with the controller. This is not a separate purchase. You don't have to pay extra for this. It by default comes with it. It is magnetically attached to the back of it, actually, with quite a strong magnet to the point that you can actually play with it attached if you want to. But there are a couple of cool things about this dock. For one, if you plug it into a high-speed USB port, it will use high-speed charging to actually charge the controller on it much faster while it's laying there. But another cool thing is, of course, you've got a dongle, and you need the dongle in order to provide the wireless support if you're not using Bluetooth. And the charging dock actually has a separate spot for this dongle to plug in at if you want to. So that means if you're using this dock, you can have it and the wireless capability all in one USB port rather than having to take up 2 separate ports. But another thing that helps this from being too much of a gimmick is that even though it's really convenient and useful for it to work that way, you also don't have to use it. You're not forced to use it if you don't want to. If you just want to have the dongle plugged into a USB port and occasionally plug the controller in directly with a wired connection and just do it that way, you can. You're not forced to use this dock or its built-in port if you don't want to. So in order to put it through its paces, especially because the Turtle Beach has sort of like a proprietary wireless protocol that is supposed to be extremely low latency, bordering on the kind of latency you would get with a wired connection. So that's obviously the kind of thing that I wanted to test to see how true that actually was. So I chose a couple of different games that represent different sorts of genres that are going to be more commonly controller focused. So the first thing I tried was Kill Knight. Because they're called twin stick shooters for a reason, you should have twin sticks for them. The game even recommends using a controller as soon as you start it up. And Kill Knight is a particularly good one to use as a test in my opinion because it requires very fast reflexes and really low latency in order for you to succeed at all because it's all extremely fast and frantic. And I gotta say, I was really impressed with the wireless latency on this thing. It feels really responsive, partially because of those really nice microswitches on all the buttons, but partially because it seems like they're actually telling the truth when it comes to their really low latency wireless connection. It does feel extremely low latency. They are actually right about that. You do not have much of a gap in between pressing a button and then your character doing whatever it is that they're supposed to do. Even on wireless mode, it all happens extremely fast. As a result, there was absolutely no problem playing Kill Knight with it. In fact, it was probably the best controller I've used so far to play this game with because of its responsiveness, the high accuracy of its analog sticks, and the fact that the dash button is micro-switched, which just feels really good to use. Another one I tried was Dragon Ball Sparking Zero because, hey, fighting games, this isn't a typical fighting game, but it does still count. And it also works really good for this. This is a lot of fast but precise button press combinations, and things like that are kind of important in this game because of the way the controls work are a little bit complicated. And you just need a very responsive controller in order to feel like you're really in control in this game. If you don't have one, then you kind of feel like you're fighting the controls because of the way they're bound by default. But I found that with the Stealth Ultra, it worked very well, and pulling off longer combos and things was highly responsive, and I had absolutely no difficulties with it at all. Another one I tried was Earth Defense Force World Brothers 2 because, hey, third-person shooters, that's another really common controller-dominated genre, and yeah, it works great for that as well. The analog sticks have a really smooth feel, so that means aiming and stuff in a first or third-person environment feels very responsive, and even toggling around with some of the stick curves and dead zones and stuff in real time with that screen means that you can dial in exactly the right sensitivity and feel that you want, which is a pretty big deal to be able to do all of that without needing an external program. So overall, after using it for a couple of weeks now, I really like the Stealth Ultra as a controller. I think it definitely earns its price by having extremely high build quality and very high quality components. In terms of those micro switches and Hall effect components, that means it's going to last a very long time. I do have a couple of little bits of weirdness about it though that I should probably mention. For one, the select button on the controller is in the same spot as the select button on a PlayStation controller, a PS4 or PS5. And this is okay for those controllers because the analog stick, the left analog stick, is below it. It's on the bottom of the controller. But this has the left analog stick up above in the same place as it is on an Xbox controller, which means you sort of have to push it out of the way with your thumb whenever you're pressing the select button. This, you get used to it really fast, but it is initially a bit weird to have to sort of arc your thumb at an odd angle in order to press this button without also touching the stick. It's just something to get used to. Another thing that isn't really good or bad, it's just an interesting thing, is that this is a really light controller. It's like half a pound or a little bit shy of 250 grams. It's very light for a high quality controller. Generally these things, especially if you look at things like the Xbox Elite Series 2 controllers, they're usually really heavy and they have quite a bit of heft to them. This one is not. And personally, I do like heavier controllers. I think they feel better in the hand, but I also know a lot of people that do not like heavy controllers because it strains their wrists, and they prefer them to be light if they're going to use them for a long period of time. So your mileage may vary as to which one of these you prefer, but it is worth noting this is an extremely light controller, so if you do appreciate that, then you'll notice it here immediately. The only real criticism of its design that I have, I just really like a lot of its aspects a lot, are the back buttons, the buttons on the back of the controller. There are 4 of them, and they're in a nice sort of spread. It's horizontal so that it's easy to avoid pressing them accidentally, which I do appreciate. But a lot of controllers at this price point, if they're using buttons on the back, they'll have some sort of removable aspect that allows you to remove it and not have the button there if you don't want it at that time. And that's a really nice thing to have, and this controller doesn't do that. The buttons are always there whether you're using them or not. There is no removable part to them, and I think it would be nice if there was. Overall, I've had a lot of fun coming to terms with this controller and getting used to how it works and how it feels, and I am definitely going to keep using it for the foreseeable future because it just feels extremely good. Its wireless pairing has been flawless. I have not had any trouble at all getting it to pair. Every time I turn it on, within a couple seconds, it pairs automatically and off we go, so no problems there. And I just really love the feel of it. Those micro-switched buttons feel extremely responsive and nice to use. Its super low latency wireless connection is actually quite impressive, and its really smooth analog sticks and triggers mean that its analog components are just as good feeling as its switches. This controller has taken the throne as my main controller that I reach for almost everything now. It's just the one that I've been using the most recently, not just because I wanted to make a video about it, so I needed to, but also because it's just really good to use. Oh right, also the battery life, something to mention. So my way of testing battery life in controllers is to completely drain them with use and then charge them all the way up to 100% without interruption, and then use them until they go flat, and then do this again repeatedly to get an average. Out of the box, this controller was giving me about 10 hours average, which is pretty good considering that out of the box experience is with all of the features enabled, all of the lights on, all of the intensities up to max, basically the minimum battery life you could get from a controller like this. It was still at 10 hours, which is pretty impressive. However, if you actually go in and tweak some of the settings, lower the intensity on the screen, turn the lights off, things like that, then you can easily double that to about 20 hours or so, which is really impressive. And you can even push it even farther than that if you want to reduce the vibration intensity and some other things that also drain some battery. You can probably get more towards the 25 to 30 range if you're willing to tweak it even further. So overall battery life, pretty impressive. I can overall recommend this controller. I really like it, and it's taken the top spot as the one I reach for at all times for pretty much anything. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the store page for this controller if you wish to check it out yourselves. Highly recommended if you're in need of a higher end controller or just want to try one of the pricier competitors out there. If you've got the spare funds for something like this, this is definitely one of them that I would highly recommend. So thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.